he's helpfully regarded the process as an iterative process. So he wants a continual two-way dialogue, and that's why I think most of the key protagonists will be invited back in Module 4 to talk to him again, to tell him where they've got to, so that he can test the various models that are put forward that we listened to today. But I think what we've all got to hope for is that a consensus emerges, so that publishers, newspapers and magazines do regard what is set up as reasonable, but also the public, and Lord Justice Leveson modestly defines the public as himself, the published regard it as effective and credible. Clearly there has to be public confidence in the new arrangements. So I think this week Leveson has published what he regards as the draft criteria for an effective regulatory regime. He outlines 5 areas which compare favourably with the previous sort of best practice models of regulation. These are areas like effectiveness, fairness and objectivity of standards, independence and transparency of enforcement and compliance, powers and remedies, and cost. Now, on all those areas, I'd hope we can find common ground with Lord Justice Leveson, and I hope that listening to the following speakers that follow me, common ground can be found with them as well.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I'm not going to take questions yet. I'm going to, I think, give everyone a chance to have their go, and then we'll take questions. So before I introduce Martin, I ought to say this is full disclosure. The plan that the MST is developing... sorry, what? Sorry?
I'm happy to do next, but it might be wise, given that Hugh's been out there and published and everything else. That's up to you.
No, let's stick to the running order. Sorry, stick to the running order. You've confused me now. I bear a very little brain. I should say, in terms of full transparency, that the plan the MSD is developing has a sort of steering group, which I'm on. So I've been involved in this. And I did try and get Steve Hewlett to chair this in the interest of neutrality, but he couldn't. So I'm going to be scrupulously fair. So Martin will now tell you his his plan.
I was just interrupting there, partly because Steve is, as he says, part of the steering group, partly because we haven't submitted it yet. So I'll do what I can to give an outline of it, but clearly the detail is yet to be published. So apologies that you can't read the detail as yet. I think it's to start from the position Jonathan left off. I think everyone recognises that this is not an easy thing to deal with. I think it was last week, Lord Justice Leveson, it was with Stephen Dorrell, where he said, why do I see this all coming back to hit me? But it certainly seemed to us that one of the best places to start was to try and best define the problem and the context, because I think that's one of the difficulties in the past is that hasn't been done very well. And the specific problem in this case, I think does come down particularly to abuse of power by one particular, but by major companies more generally, and abuse of power in the sense of it being systematic and structural and characterized to a certain extent by a sense of immunity. And the impact of that has been both individual harm, so individual members of the public and others, but also a wider corruption of public areas of public life and distortion of the political process. And I think any new system has to try and, not immediately of course, but over time try and deal with this. At the same time, clearly, as Leveson has said virtually every day, any new system has to be acutely aware of the desperate importance of free expression and the very pragmatic difficulties of trying to do any sort of media regulation in a digital environment. So if that's the problem, what's the context? Well, thank goodness in a way that this judge is much more aware of his history than others have been, because I don't think he could make reasonable recommendations, particularly in the practicalities of recommendations, without thinking about what has happened over the past 60 years, meaning 3 Royal Commissions, 1947 to 49, 61 to 62, 74 to 77, and of course Calcut, and many, many last chance saloons. When you go back through the history, it's astonishing how many times the same phrases have been used in terms of give the press a chance to sort itself out, let us put our house in order, give us 18 months, give us 2 years. And then the cycle repeats itself. The recommendations of the various inquiries don't get fully implemented. The dissatisfaction starts to rise again, and within about 10 to 15 years, there's another inquiry or another commission. So then the question, of course, is what to do about it. And I can entirely see and sympathize with what Lord Hunt has been trying to do, which is to work out a way in which to deal with the problem without going anywhere near legislation, going anywhere near any sort of parliamentary statutory involvement at all. And I can entirely understand why he's doing that. The difficulty is that the method for doing that, by using commercial contracts, is fraught with quite a lot of problems. Just to name three, which were not mine, but were those named by Lord Justice Leveson just last week. Almost as an aside, he said, well, first of all, a contract is between two parties and not three. Secondly, he said there's all sorts of enforcement issues. And thirdly, he said, I'm not sure that it will help the little guy. All of which are pretty substantial criticisms, even if said quite offhandedly. But I suppose the one I'd add to that, which has already been mentioned by Jonathan, which is in many ways the central problem, is that there's no particular incentive to join. This system is going to be more onerous, possibly not more expensive, but certainly harder sanctions, more requirements, and therefore those people who are joining up, and they're not going to get any particular financial benefit as a result. So it's difficult to see what exactly Richard Desmond would see in it for him, other than avoiding some sort of statutory involvement. Equally, and almost more importantly, there's little incentive to stay once you're inside, other than the fact that you've signed up to a contract and it might be 3 or 5 years and you're bound to that contract. So that being the central problem, an awful lot of people have, I think, understandably spent quite a lot of time thinking about incentives and this whole issue of carrots and sticks. And I think we're going to hear quite a bit more about that in a minute. Because you look at most systems of regulation, not just in the media, but across different sectors, and most of them rely and sustained through some form of incentives. So if you're in the jockey club, for example, you get to race. If you're not, you don't. It's a pretty basic incentive in some circumstances. It's much less basic in others. It's clearly a lot more complex in the case of the media, because no one wants to stop anyone else from publishing. So therefore, people have thought quite carefully about fiscal incentives, about information-type incentives, and legal incentives. Fiscal incentives in the form of things like tax breaks, like trying to only give VAT exemption to those who are part of a system. Information incentives, like essentially sort of accreditation, closed shop, if you like, so only those who are a member of the system are able to get access to certain types of information. And legal privileges, which I won't talk so much about because I know Hugh is going to talk about those in more detail. I think the first thing to say is there's nothing at all wrong with incentives in theory. In fact, as I say, most regulatory systems have incentives, and incentives are often crucial to making the system sustainable. The problem, the particular problem, is how to avoid making them, and excuse the expression, but making them too carroty or too sticky. To give you an example, the VAT exemption, which we're lucky we can talk about in a kind of an academic way because it's pretty much been ruled out by Lord Justice Leveson as being too difficult, partly because of European law. But let's say it wasn't, let's say it was viable. If you took away VAT exemption from the Express Group, that would cost Mr. Desmond something like £45 million a year. That's a pretty big stick. In many ways, you could say that was effectively licensing, because he couldn't afford to be outside a system that could threaten him with a £45 million stick. Now, clearly, it's much less for other people, but it demonstrates that actually carrots and sticks can be very, very heavy. Similarly, accreditation. I mean, not only do I have a sort of principled objection to the idea of accreditation, but in the modern day and age, how on earth would you want to, or would you be able to stop people gaining access to sporting events or to certain public events or government events, etc.? So I think there are quite a lot of issues around incentives. That's not to say they shouldn't be used, but there are a lot of questions around how to get the balance right on incentives. And I'll come, as I say, just a short outline of where that leaves us, because in a way it brings us back to the beginning, which is to say, why not do something rather a lot simpler? At the beginning of this whole process, when, particularly last July, when there was lots of upset and outrage, yep, oh yes, there was general agreement, and I think between many people there still is general agreement that self-regulation is much more preferable than any form of government or statutory or other form of regulation. I think even Ofcom agrees with that. But the problem is getting self-regulation to work. So why not create a system where there is an oversight body whose purpose is to audit self-regulation to make sure that it's working? At the same time, if the problem is about abuse of power by major companies, why spend an awful lot of time worrying about individuals publishing, small publishers, small news sites, even quite medium or large-sized news sites? Focus on where the problem is, which is on big companies. And within the law, we already have rather a good way, a very well-established way of distinguishing between different sizes of organizations, most recently, particularly in the Companies Act 2006. So why not set a threshold? Why not set a threshold really rather high? Why not say that anyone who is a small company or below should have no regulatory obligations whatsoever? But anyone above that size, in other words, who earns more than 6.5 million in revenue per year or has more than 50 employees, ought to have some obligations. They already do in terms of various other things. They have in terms of financial reporting, in terms of legal reporting, in terms of health and safety, in terms of information protection. So why not give them obligations that is commensurate with their size? So any large news publisher over that size should be obliged, again, not to do anything that they shouldn't be doing already, but to essentially self-regulate. Exactly as Jonathan was saying, they should have some sort of basic internal complaints and compliance mechanisms, and they should be members of some form of self-regulatory system. And then an independent backstop auditor audits them on an annual basis simply to see that they're working. Highly constrained, only able to look at process, not at content. That's it. It's as simple as that. And as I say, I'm happy to go into more detail.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Right. Not a dissimilar system, but just with the backstop set in law. Okay. Right. Thank you. Well, okay. We'll get into more detail with the questions. Max, over to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. I think it's probably useful to start off by trying to define what the problem is. In other words, what's wrong with what we have at the moment. And I would suggest there are 4 major areas. The first one is cost. The second one is what to do about breaching the rules. The third one is the PCC, and the fourth one is the internet. Try and deal very quickly with those and then come to what I think may be the solution. Cost is a fundamental problem. If you want to sue for breach of privacy or defamation at the moment, to have a trial, you've got to be prepared or able to put £1 million at risk. Just for an injunction, it's tens of thousands of pounds. The number of people who can afford to do that in this country is very, very limited. So probably 99% of the population have no access to the courts if it's a question of breach of privacy or defamation.